Chapter 3. No man ever healed himself by wounding another. St. Ambrose. It was coming towards the end of the month duration that I'd agreed to. Billy had mentioned that her father, the one she was commuting to Sydney to look after while he received some very specialised cancer treatment for a special type of cancer, had suggested, "Why don't you get her to move in permanently?" I felt a bit chuffed at the acceptance, but who wouldn't accept me considering I'd put on my absolute best people-pleasing behaviour, even at the expense of my own happiness. I'd not met the father, neither had I met her ex-husband, now friend, but I imagine he must be one of the few understanding males that exist. He'd understood Billy's coming out and leaving him. I could have remembered the father's condition as a sign of respect, but I don't retain people's complicated medical information, particularly when I'm having to retain a lot of info about Billy's hard knock life. I wondered if I could hack living there permanently. It was a bit isolated and I didn't know anyone in Canberra or Sheepton. I'd be fully dependent on Billy for company, and even though I had a good enough income not to work, I was even saving money living here rent-free. Part of my ego death theory is that physical hard work is very good for me. It gave me a purpose, it tired me out physically so I always got good sleep, and it meant I could travel overseas with no guilt about spending my savings. And I'd been doing this off and on for years, absolutely shelving the cash. I'm a thrifty bitch like that. I discovered this nearly 10 years ago when I lived in Melbourne. I was sewing my own design dresses and selling them at markets. The markets weren't earning me enough money. Those middle-class Vic women really spent when they came across my dress stall in Cairns and Port Douglas while they were on holidays. Some went so far as befriending me and asking me for my social media contacts. It was similar to when Aussies go to Bali and try really hard to make friends with the locals. Makes them feel like locals too. I went along with it, even if they weren't my kind of people. Back in their home environment and in the cold weather, they weren't into my sexy little apron dresses. It was a slog. I came up with the idea of using my van for courier work when I saw one of those permanent ads in a free suburban newspaper. Van owners needed to work for a courier company that worked for businesses. Never from a depot like online shopping deliveries. It was point A to point B and was really only worth the set delivery price, not hourly rate, so it was pretty shit money if you picked up more deliveries between these 2 points. I'd always get caught by a particularly nasty dispatch operator, a young male of course, as I crossed the city. He'd throw me all these bullshit jobs and I couldn't say no. I was learning the layout of Melbourne as it was, so I was often late and overwhelmed by everything that was put on my plate. I felt harassed in this job. As luck would have it, I did a delivery for a clothing delivery firm that already had van delivery employees, but didn't have any spares sometimes. The dispatch guys were so helpful and friendly. They saw that I'd put up rails lengthwise along my van's body to hang clothes on, used during my market days, and they were impressed. One of them suggested that I come work for them. A forklift operator happened to be around when I was loading. He came for a yarn, and when he learned that I worked for this other courier mob, he shared that he'd worked for them too. "They're shit house, you should come work here." It was all the encouragement I needed. During this job, I gave up alcohol. I moved from some very dodgy accommodations I'd been living in to a share house with a friend from Cairns. I then bought the Port Melbourne apartment and started to live a life that brought me peace, tranquility and happiness. I was the best I'd ever been. And when you reach that level, something always comes along to ruin it. The fucking, as I've heard it described as online. This was a someone, and initially I thought it was just more good fortune. An ex-boyfriend I'd had a loose relationship in my 20s while I lived in North Queensland. It was loose because he flew in from a mine site once a month. He'd been back living in New Zealand this whole time. We broke up because he went home. He tracked me down through my brother's fast book, so I figured he was at least keen. He was visiting Australia to help a relative and decided to see if I was about. When I rang him that day, I'll never forget the conversation. It was like we'd never parted. Both at similar stages in life with no heavy divorces, no children, no responsibilities. It was a bit rushed on his behalf, but we decided to give it a go. I flew up to Brownsville to see him and I ignored all the red flags. When we were young, I was punching above my weight with this blue-eyed, blonde-haired pakeha who women would drool over and he would barely notice. Now it was the other way around. He looked very, very worn and I still didn't look my age. I knew he only smoked pot, was never a drinker, so I figured it was years spent sailing, boat building and generally living in the weather. Other red flags were his political and cultural war views. He turned into a grumpy middle-aged male who repeated everything he read online, like he'd thought of it originally. We lived separately for a few months till I planned to leave my job, rent out my apartment and move to New Zealand. It was a great adventure to me. He'd also recounted that a boat building firm in Fiji who'd hired him before wanted him again and he'd negotiate the contract, with me thrown in. So not only beautiful Aotearoa, but Fiji as well. How could I refuse? I lasted a month. He wasn't the friendly, devoted man I'd met in Brownsville or the one I dated in my 20s. I seemed to annoy him and I reacted badly to it. I was heartbroken. We left on good terms, but when I was back in Sydney, I made the mistake of looking up his fast book to show a friend the boats he'd built. Before I'd arrived in New Zealand, he'd hosted backpackers. He talked about these with glowing descriptions of a French girl and her friend, a guy, and also how she'd broken up from a boyfriend. I saw a post where he'd taken her to the little island of Whangarei where he'd taken me. There was also vids of them picnicking in the park near the boat shed where I lived, where I'd stayed with him. A few other suspect things like him being online with Fastbook Messenger at late hours of the night. He wasn't smart enough to turn off his online status. Apart from heartbreak that I wasn't the one he truly desired, for if this French woman had wanted to be with him, he would have definitely told me not to come. I was also terribly angry with myself for not heeding the signs, despite me being sensible and sober now. While we lived separately, before I went over, I too had had a fling with a French traveller, a gorgeous young Congolese male from Paris who worked in finance and was wealthy enough to travel to Australia for a month only. He was into me for the great sex we had, not for accommodation, free drugs, yacht trips and an ego boost like the French woman probably was with my ex. I could have been wrong about that, but she would have stayed with him if she wanted him. I was furious that I'd chosen a dumb midlife crisis male who carried a torch for someone so much younger than him. I'd ended things with the French traveller because my ex was no competition for him, in looks and in the sack. I felt it wouldn't be fair to my ex if I kept seeing the French guy, and it might have made me less attracted to him. The French guy was just sex, and my ex was real relationship potential. I'd done the right thing on that front, but he had no intention of doing similar. So it was a fucking mess when I found that out. I decided to spend some savings and booked a flight to Thailand and later Vietnam. I loved it. Heartbreak is definitely healed by going to another country and culture. I did a yoga retreat thing in southern Thailand and a 10-day silence Vipassana meditation retreat in Ho Chi Minh. Both were hard, but they helped. Then I got the confidence to go real traveling. I journeyed along the southern coast of the European continent for a few months, even catching up and staying with an Italian woman I'd met on the beach in Thailand. She lived in a traditional old northern Italian village. I had a few lows for sure, but I found myself. By the time I got to Greece, I'd planned to go home. My parents were having a wedding anniversary party and I felt obliged. It was a bad idea in hindsight. I didn't enjoy it one bit. That's the level of commitment I put into my family for no reward. I only spent 3 days in mainland Greece in the Athenian suburb of Exarchia. I decided that this was my favourite place in Europe for its crazy, riotous, anarchistic vibe. I was so disappointed that I had to leave the place so early. Once back in North Queensland at my parents' house, I knew I had to escape for my own sanity. This is when I took on the rental lease to live in the state forest. My landlord, Madeline, who occupied an old logger's cottage on the property, was an autistic physics genius who was self-taught in all things solar power and off-grid living. I admired her, but I resented when I'd have to occasionally care for her, when we'd go to nighttime outings and she found loud noises, people laughing, etc., torturous in that autistic symptomatic way. She never spoke directly about being autistic either, so I was resentful about her lack of self-awareness. Maybe she was fully across it, but she didn't want to tell me. She was a real survivor, having only herself to rely on while her parents lived in Quebec. She would have seen how kind and empathetic I was towards her, and I felt that she took advantage of me because of it. While I love my mountain sanctuary, so private that in summer I was able to walk around with no clothes on, it contributed to my depression. My depression left me when I started living in Beach Town and got another courier job. I was by the city beach with full electricity, nice warm shower, and a gas stove and oven. It was a huge change from holding a shower head above me with one hand while catching the water in a bucket to later hand wash my clothes in, not to mention the compost toilet which I had to empty out in the bush. When you deny yourself the creature comforts that everyone else takes for granted, you really appreciate the simple things in life. I was Buddhist in this appreciation, and I loved decorating a place that was all mine, even if it was only one room housing my lounge, kitchen, and bedroom. This was the courier job that I eventually had to give up. I suffered when that happened, not in a financial way. I could have hunkered down, not spent much, and lived a retiree life, but in every other way. Beachtown held a very bad taste in my mouth after that. The bullying I from the company even delivered paper to a neighbouring business on my street. I needed to get away from there. So I rented out that apartment and hit the road attempting the lap around Australia. My depression about having something I was good at taken away from me like that clouded what should have been a very happy adventure. I was also menopausal as hell, and that really sucks the life out of you. Hits your confidence for six. No matter how little confidence I have in myself, there's always enough to travel solo, even overseas. I know I can move in big crowds, be a nobody, and soak up an actual culture. Traveling Australia doesn't grab me as much as traveling other countries, but it's better than sitting still. I know I was luckier than most because of my income stream. Most women had to get a divorce settlement to get that type of money. Still, I couldn't help feeling that preventing a solo woman from doing a good job and earning her own income was an entirely misogynistic act that burned at the heart of my feminist separatist identity. As far as the lap went, I only made it to Exmouth, Western Australia. I was planning on heading to Broome, but the Fitzroy Crossing Bridge collapsed in a massive early wet season flood. There was no point in going to Broome as they'd evacuated a lot of flooded community people out to that busy but tiny town. I would just be another mouth to feed at the supermarket. It was a good decision in the end because it took months for the crossing to be rebuilt, and there was absolutely no other road to take along the top end. Since my time was up at Amsterdam, I decided to try my luck in Darwin, since I'd not made it during the lap. I had an uncle there who had a big empty house and mentioned I could stay when I caught up with he and my cousins in Perth. Harry was my mother's only brother, and though he shared my mother's right-wing views, he was a bit gentler than her. I loved his two daughters, my cousins, very much. They were my kind of people, lefty, progressive, and feminist to boot. I would have loved to go to Perth, as my cousin had urged me. It's nice to go where you're wanted. But housing was at a premium in Perth, not enough and dear as fire. Darwin was the same, but there was room at my uncle's. I still had a bee in my bonnet about that Beachtown warehouse job. I planned to go to the Sydney headquarters of the company. I wanted to see if they could give me a job driving in the city as a part-time casual relieving driver for anyone sick or on holidays. By doing this, I would also have my opportunity to explain what had gone down in the Beachtown warehouse. I was nervous about it, understandably, and went over what I would say in my head. I'd worked myself up into a state. So when it came time to leave, I surprised myself by tearing up when I gave Billy a farewell hug. She was kind, understanding, and supportive. This made me classify her as my tribe. I now valued her friendship. Another supportive move she'd made was to offer me some space in her garage to leave my stuff. I was still carrying all my motorcycle accessories stock around, along with things I'd use if I ever set up house again. Rugs, books, a cardboard concertina double bed base, and appliances for if I've ever settled in my own place. This also meant that I had the property as a base. I now considered Billy like family. She knew my difficulties with my family of origin, so she'd stepped in as a family of loyalty. Her mention of living there permanently was attractive. I had to go and spread my wings, catch some freedom first, for any jobs that I found either in Sydney or up in the Northern Territory would be temporary. I didn't want to permanently live in either places, and if I did, well, I'd work that out later.